The invitation arrived 3 days before the human ship did, and scorekeeper Vesh Oda spent every hour of those 3 days certain the humans would not come. She kept the certainty the way a careful clerk keeps a balance. The threshing reach had run the long decision for 9,000 years, and in all that counting, only one rule had never broken. Everyone who was invited came. They came to watch their wars decided without blood. They came to argue the score. They came because the Reach had taught the whole arm of the sky that a battle fought in the Great Machine was as true as a battle fought in the dark, and far, far cheaper. 9,000 years of fleets that never burned. 9,000 years of grief that never happened. The proudest piece anyone had ever built, and it was built out of make-believe. Vesh Oda was the 17th scorekeeper of her line. Her people, the Atu, were small and gray and patient, with 4 soft hands and eyes that read numbers faster than they read faces. They did not fight, they counted. For 9,000 years the Atu had sat at the high desk of the threshing arena and watched 2 powers feed their fleets into the machine, and when the simulation ended, they read out who had won and who had lost, and the loser bowed and paid and went home with every ship still warm. No one had died at the threshing in 90 centuries. That was the whole point. That was the miracle. The arena itself was the proof. It was a moon, hollowed and rebuilt, a single structure 90 kilometers across, and it had been raised over the long centuries by every species that ever came to settle a quarrel inside it. The high galleries could seat the heralds of 300 powers. The deep tank, where the modeled fleets fought their wars of cold blue fire, was so vast that a real cruiser could have flown laps inside it. And at the core, under everything, ran the machine, the thing the whole arm of the sky had built its peace upon, and Vesh Oda had spent 200 years learning to read its breathing. She knew its sounds the way a mother knows a sleeping child. She knew the small lag it took before a hard branch closed. She knew, she thought, everything there was to know about it. She would learn, in 3 days, how little that was. There was a thing the Atu said, taught to every young scorekeeper before they were allowed to touch the logs. The number is kinder than the war. It meant that a battle counted was a battle no widow mourned. A fleet decided was a fleet still warm in its birth. And Vesh Oda had believed it her whole life. Because it was true, and because it was the gentlest thing anyone had ever managed to make true in a galaxy that had spent its youth burning. She still believed it, mostly, even after. But she had learned to add the second half, the half the humans had carried across the dark to teach her. The number is kinder than the war, right up until the moment it is the thing that kills you. So when the human invitation went out, Vesh Oda assumed the silence she got back was a refusal. The humans were new. They had come up the long road from one small wet world only 400 years ago, and in those 400 years they had done almost nothing the Reach approved of. They had never entered the machine. They had never submitted a fleet for modeling. They had never once let the great simulation decide a quarrel for them, the way every civilized power did. When 2 human factions disagreed, they spoke, or they waited, or, in the worst old days that they themselves were ashamed of, they actually fought, with real ships, in real dark, and real people did not come home. The Reach found this barbaric. The Reach found this wasteful. The Reach had voted, in a chamber Vesh Oda kept the minutes for, to call the humans the last unsimulated people, and the vote had not been kind. Vesh Oda had argued, quietly, in the chamber where the vote was held, that the word barbaric was the wrong word. She had not argued that the humans were right. She would never have dared. She had only pointed out, in the careful way of a clerk who does not want to be noticed, that a people who had never once submitted a fleet to the machine were the only people in the arm of the sky about whom the machine knew nothing at all, and that knowing nothing about a thing was not the same as knowing it was small. Her note had been entered into the minutes and ignored. She had filed her own copy. She had a habit of keeping the things everyone else threw away. It was the only habit she had that ever turned out to matter. But the long decision needed a final witness. Every 9,000 years the machine itself was due to be renewed, its deep logic checked against the living galaxy, and the old law said the renewal must be watched by one who had never used it, a neutral hull, an outsider with no stake in any score. The reasoning behind the law was old and elegant. A people who used the machine could not certify it, because they trusted it, and a thing certified by those who already believe it is not certified at all. Only an outsider, a people who had never once let the machine decide anything, could look at the renewal with clean eyes and say whether it was true. The Reach had looked across the whole arm of stars for a people who had never once fed a war into the machine, and there was exactly one. So they invited the humans to watch, only to watch, to sit in the visitor's berth and observe the greatest simulated battle ever staged, the renewal contest between the two oldest powers of the Reach, and to certify that the machine had judged it true. A ceremony, a formality, a small gray ship in a corner of an arena the size of a moon, lending its strangeness to a rite 9,000 years old. Vesh Oda had drafted the certificate herself. She had left a blank line for the human signature and assumed it would stay blank. Then the watch buoys at the third gate woke up and sang, and the long readout on her high desk filled with a shape she had never logged, and the human ship came in. It came in slowly. That was the first wrong thing. Every fleet that ever entered the threshing arrived loud, decelerating hard, throwing light, announcing tonnage, because the size of your arrival was the first move in every contest. The humans came in like a thought arriving at the edge of sleep. No light, no broadcast. A single hull, dark and long and matte, the gray of a stone that has been underwater 1,000 years, with no banner painted on it and no name that any scope could find. It slid through the third gate at a speed so gentle the buoys had to check 3 times that it was moving at all, and it took its assigned berth in the visitor's ring, and it stopped, and it did nothing. It was 900 meters long. Vesh Oda read the number twice. In an arena built to hold contests between fleets of 40,000 ships, in a hall whose smallest practice cruiser ran to 3 kilometers, the human witness was a splinter, a gray splinter, sitting in its corner, silent. She ran the standard reads on it, the way she ran them on every hull that entered her arena, because cataloging the arrivals was the first duty of the desk. The reads came back strange. The mass was wrong for the size, far too much of it, as though the ship were not 900 meters of hull but 900 meters of something denser and quieter, folded into the shape of a ship. The power signature was wrong too, or rather it was missing, because a ship that size should have shown the warm bloom of its drives, and its weapons, and its many systems, and the human ship showed almost nothing, a cold even glow like a stone that has held the day's heat and given it back slowly into the night. The scopes could not find its guns. Vesh Oda assumed this meant it had few. She would learn that it meant the opposite, that a thing which shows no guns is not a thing without guns, but a thing that has decided you do not need to see them yet, the way a grown animal does not bare its teeth at children. The Herald of the Vels, who held the east half of the renewal contest, laughed when the scope showed him the size of it. The Herald of the Karun, who held the west, did not laugh, and Vesh Oda noted that too, because the Karun had been counting things for almost as long as the Atu, and had learned not to laugh at silences. The human ship sent one message. It was short. It was not a boast. It said only that the witness had arrived, that the witness thanked the Reach for the seat, and that the witness would watch. Then it added one line that Vesh Oda read 4 times and could not make fit any of the 9,000 years of records behind her. The line said, "The witness would watch, and the witness hoped the Reach would not mind a question later when the watching was done." A question. Nobody asked questions at the threshing. The machine did not take questions. The machine took fleets and ran them against each other inside its vast cold logic, and gave back a number, and the number was the truth, and there was nothing to ask. You did not question the score. Questioning the score was the one heresy the Reach had no patience for, because the whole piece stood on it. If the score could be questioned, the score could be doubted, and if the score could be doubted, then someday 2 powers would look at a number they did not like, and decide to find out the truth the old way, with real ships, in real dark. Vesh Oda filed the line under courtesy and tried to forget it. She was good at filing. She had been doing it for 200 years. She was not good at forgetting. That, it would turn out, was the part of her that mattered. The renewal contest would run for 3 days. On the first day, the two old powers would feed their grandest fleets into the machine and let it model a war that would have taken 40 years and 10 million lives to fight for real, and the machine would compress it into hours, and at the end, one fleet would stand, and one would be reckoned gone, and not a single living soul would be touched. On the second day, the Atu would read the deep logs and certify that the machine had judged without flaw. On the third day, the witness would sign, and the long decision would be renewed, and the peace would roll on for another 9,000 years. That was the plan, written in a hand older than Vesh Oda's grandmother's grandmother. She looked down from the high desk at the small gray splinter in the visitor's ring, the only ship in the arena that had never once trusted the machine, and she felt, for no reason she could have defended, a cold thread of doubt slide down the back of her four-handed certainty. The human ship was not built like a witness. She had certified the hulls of 900 fleets in her life, and she had learned to read the shape of a thing's purpose in the curve of its skin, and the human ship was the wrong shape for watching. It had the long, quiet lines of something that did, not something that observed. It sat very still in its corner, the way a grown animal sits still in a room full of loud children, not because it is small but because it has decided, for now, to be gentle. Vesh Oda told herself she was tired. She told herself the number on her desk, 900 meters, was the whole truth of the thing, and the number was small. The number was small. She would remember thinking that. She would remember it for the rest of her long life, the moment she looked at the smallest ship in the arena and believed the smallest thing about it, because the moment she stopped believing that was the moment everything she had counted for 200 years came quietly, completely apart. The first day began. The two old fleets entered the machine. The lights of the great arena dimmed for the contest, and 40,000 modeled ships of the Vels and 38,000 of the Karun bloomed in the deep tank in cold blue fire, and the whole reach leaned in to watch a war that would cost nothing. And in the visitor's ring, the small gray splinter that had never trusted any of it watched too, and waited, and did not move, and held its one question like a stone in a closed hand. The machine that ran the long decision was older than any living memory, and larger than most worlds, and Vesh Oda loved it the way you love a thing you do not fully understand. It filled the core of the arena moon, a sphere of cold logic 40 kilometers across, and it did one thing better than anything else in the galaxy. It imagined wars. You gave it your fleet, every hull, every gun, every captain's habit and every engine's flaw, down to the smallest bolt, and you gave it your enemy's fleet the same way, and it built both inside itself out of pure number and let them fight. It modeled everything, the way a shield failed under sustained fire, the way a frightened crew aimed wide, the way a clever admiral spent his weak ships to bait a trap. It ran the whole war forward 1 billion times along 1 billion branching paths and counted which side stood at the end of more of them, and that count was the score, and the score was the truth. The Reach trusted it the way Vesh Oda's people trusted gravity. On the first day it ran the Vels against the Karun, and it was beautiful. Vesh Oda watched from the high desk as the two modeled fleets met in the deep tank. The Vels came in a great curved wall, 40,000 strong, their grand carrier the iron halo at the center wearing 9 rings of escorts. The Karun answered in 3 spears, 38,000 hulls driving for the seams in the Vels formation, the old patient knife-work of a people who had been counting weaknesses for 11,000 years. The machine ran them together and the tank filled with cold blue fire as 10 million imaginary souls fought a war that would never leave a single real widow. It was the most honest war Vesh Oda had ever seen, because it was not real, and so no one had any reason to lie about it. That was the secret the Reach never said out loud, the secret under the whole piece. A real war is full of lies. The frightened admiral lies about his losses. The proud captain lies about his fear. The empire lies to its own people about whether the thing can be won at all, and the lies pile up until no one, not the winner and not the loser, can say with any honesty what truly happened in the dark. But a modeled war had no liars in it, because no one in it was real. The ships were numbers. The crews were habits. The whole vast bloody thing was made of pure measured fact, and so the score that came out the far end was the cleanest truth the galaxy had. That was the genius of it. The Reach had not made war honest. It had made war imaginary, and imaginary things cannot lie, and the Reach had called that honesty and built a peace on it that lasted 90 centuries. Vesh Oda had spent her life inside that honesty and loved it. She still did. The thing she had not seen, the thing no one in 9,000 years had seen, was that an imaginary war can be perfectly honest and still be perfectly useless the moment your enemy declines to be imaginary. The Vels and the Karun were the two oldest quarreling powers in the Reach, and they had been chosen for the renewal because their quarrel was the oldest one the machine had ever kept the peace on. Once, before the machine, they had fought for real, and the histories said the fighting had lasted 400 years and emptied 1,000 worlds, and that the grief of it was still carried in the names the Vels gave their children. Then the machine had come, and the Vels and the Karun had brought their quarrel to the deep tank instead of to the dark, and in 9,000 years they had settled it 100 times over without a single new grave. They still hated each other. The machine had not ended the hate. It had only made the hate cheap, drained it of its dead, turned a war into a contest, and a contest into a thing you could lose with your honor intact and your fleet still warm. That was the proudest claim of the Reach, and it was a true claim, and Vesh Oda had recited it at the opening of the renewal with her whole heart. She read the running logs and certified each branch as it closed. The machine showed its work, as it always did. Here the Karun left spear broke against the iron halo, and the score swung blue toward the Vels. Here the Karun center found a seam, and the score swung back. By the end of the first day the contest stood almost even, the most evenly matched renewal in 9,000 years, and the whole Reach was thrilled, because an even contest meant the machine was at its sharpest, and the renewal of the machine was the whole reason they were there. The human witness watched all of it, and said nothing. Vesh Oda kept glancing at the small gray splinter in the visitor's ring, and she could not stop. The human ship had not moved in 2 days. It had not fed a fleet into the machine, because it had not been asked to, and would not have if it had. It had not argued the score, because it had no stake in the score. It simply sat, dark and quiet, and watched the great beautiful war of numbers unfold, and Vesh Oda had the growing and unprofessional sense that it was watching the way a grown teacher watches children play at a game the children think is real. On the evening of the second day, against every rule of decorum, she sent the human ship a private line. She told herself it was research. The renewal certificate needed the witness to understand the right, and a confused witness signed nothing. So she sent a courteous note explaining the score, the even contest, the beauty of the machine's honesty, and she ended it, almost without meaning to, by asking whether the witness was satisfied. The answer came back slowly, the way the ship did everything. The witness said it had a name, which it had not given before because no one had asked. The name was the Long Patience. It said that the Long Patience had watched the contest with great care and great respect, and that the machine was indeed the most honest war it had ever seen modeled, and that this was exactly the problem. Vesh Oda read that and felt the cold thread again. She asked the human ship what it meant. The Long Patience answered with a question of its own, the question it had carried in its closed hand since it arrived. It asked whether, in 9,000 years, the machine had ever modeled a war that one side could not have won. Vesh Oda did not understand the question at first. Then she did, and she wished she had not. Every war the machine ran was a war between two fleets that had agreed to be measured. Both sides submitted. Both sides accepted that the score was the truth. The machine modeled which of two submitted fleets would stand at the end, and it was perfect at that, the most perfect thing the galaxy had ever built. But it had never once modeled a war against a fleet that refused to be measured. It had never modeled an enemy who did not submit, did not agree to the rules, did not accept the score, and simply kept coming after the count said it should be gone. There had never been such an enemy in the Reach, because the Reach was peace, because the machine was the peace, because for 9,000 years everyone had agreed to let the number decide. The long patience asked its question a second way, more gently, the way you repeat a hard thing to someone who is not ready. It asked, what does the machine do when it meets a thing it cannot model? Vesh Oda's first thought was that the question made no sense, because the machine could model anything. That was what it was. 40 kilometers of cold logic that had imagined 10 million wars, that knew the failure curve of every shield ever built and the aim drift of every frightened crew, that had never once been handed a fleet it could not run. The idea of a thing the machine could not model was to her like the idea of a number too large to count. There was no such number, you simply kept counting. But she was a scorekeeper, and a scorekeeper's whole art is the art of the missing value. She knew, better than anyone in the arena, that the machine did not model the world. It modeled the inputs it was given, and the inputs were always, a fleet that had agreed to be a fleet, that fought the way fleets fight, that broke off when the count went against it, because that was the rule everyone in the Reach had agreed to. The machine had never been given an input that refused the rules, because in 9,000 years no such input had ever walked into the arena, and a machine that has only ever been fed agreement does not know it is missing anything. It thinks agreement is the world. It will fill any gap with more agreement, confidently, and call the confident filling a truth. And Vesh Oda, scorekeeper of her line, keeper of the deep logs, the one soul in the arena whose whole life was reading the machine, sat at her high desk and realized she did not know. In 9,000 years the question had never come up. The machine had never met a thing it could not model, because everything it had ever met had agreed, first, to be a thing the machine could measure. The submission was the camouflage. The whole galaxy had handed the machine only the wars it already knew how to count, and called the machine all-knowing, and never once tested it against the one war it could not. She should have closed the line. She was a scorekeeper. Doubt was the heresy. She had the minutes of the vote that named doubt the enemy of the peace. She did not close the line. She asked the human ship how it knew. The long patience told her, slowly, across the quiet of the second night, while the arena slept, and the modeled fleets hung frozen in the tank waiting for the third day. It told her that humanity had built a machine like this once, long ago, in its loud and foolish youth, on the one wet world before the road to the stars. Humanity had built a machine to model its wars so it would not have to fight them, and for a while the machine had worked, and humanity had been proud, and humanity had stopped keeping real fleets because the machine said who would win, and everyone agreed to believe it. And then, the long patience said, an enemy had come who did not agree. It did not say who. It said only that the enemy had not submitted, had not accepted the score, had looked at the machine's confident number and kept coming, and the machine had had no answer, because the machine had never been built to imagine a thing that would not play. The number said humanity was safe. Humanity believed the number. Humanity had let its real fleets rust because the model was so good, and by the time humanity understood that a perfect model of a war you have agreed to is no protection at all against a war the enemy has not agreed to, humanity had almost not survived it. Almost. The long patience used that word with great care. Humanity had survived, barely, by remembering in time the one thing the machine had taught it to forget, which was that a war is not a number, and the truth of a war is not decided by counting the branches you can imagine, and the only fleet that keeps you safe is a real one, in real dark, crewed by people who have agreed to nothing. Humanity had kept its machines after that. It still ran simulations, more and better than the Reach ever had, but it had made one law, written in the keel of every ship it built, and the law was this: the model serves the fleet. The fleet never serves the model. You may use the machine to learn. You may never use the machine to decide. Because the day you let the number decide is the day you have handed your throat to the first enemy who refuses to count. The long patience told her a thing about that old war that Vesh Oda would never forget, because it explained, in one image, the whole difference between her people and the humans. It said that on the worst day of that ancient war, when the enemy who would not be counted was already inside the home system, and the machine was still patiently reporting that the home system was safe, there had been an argument among the humans who built the machine. Some of them had wanted to fix the model, to add the new enemy to it, to teach the machine this new way of fighting, to make the number right again. And one human, whose name the long patience did not give, had said the thing that saved the species. The human had said, "We do not need a better model. We need to stop asking the model and start asking the dark." And humanity had stopped asking the model and gone out into the real dark with its real and rusting fleet, and barely lived. The lesson was not that the machine had been wrong. The lesson was that no machine, however right, could ever be the thing you trusted with your life, because the trust itself was the wound the enemy aimed for. Vesh Oda sat very still. She thought of 9,000 years of fleets that never burned. She thought of the proudest piece anyone had ever built. She thought of how it was built, every brick of it, on the one belief that the score was the truth, and she felt the brick at the bottom of the whole great wall turn very slightly under her, the way the ground turns under you in the first half-second before you understand that it is going to keep turning. She asked the long patience the only question left. She asked whether the Reach was in danger. The human ship did not answer right away. When it did, it was kind, and the kindness was the worst part. It said that the witness did not know. It said that the long patience had come to watch, as it had been asked, and had seen a piece built on a model so good and so unbroken that the whole galaxy had forgotten the model could be broken. It said that a piece like that was a beautiful thing and a fragile thing, and that the longer it stood unbroken, the more certain everyone became that it could not break, and the more certain they became, the less they kept anything real that could save them when it did. It said the Reach had not kept real fleets in 9,000 years. It said the Reach had not needed to. It said that need was a thing you only discovered you had after it was too late to meet it. And it said last that the witness had one more question, the real one, the one it had carried in its closed hand since the third gate, and it asked permission to ask it the next day, in the open, before the whole Reach, on the third day of the renewal, when the witness was meant to sign. She lay awake the rest of that night, which the Atu rarely did, because the Atu were a calm people and sleep came to them like a closing ledger. She lay awake and she thought about the certificate with the blank line, and she thought about the small gray ship in the corner, and she thought about the thing it had told her, the law in the keel, the model serves the fleet, and she found that she could not make the law fit anywhere in her own life, because her whole life was the other way around. She had spent 200 years making the fleet serve the model. She had taught a generation of young scorekeepers to read the number as the truth and the war as a rumor. She had certified with her own 4 hands the disarming of the proudest piece in the sky, one beautiful, honest contest at a time, and she had never once felt it as disarming, because it had never once felt like anything but wisdom. That was the part that kept her awake. Not that she might have been wrong, that she could have been this wrong for this long and felt, the whole time, so completely sure. Vesh Oda should have said no. She was the keeper of the right. The third day was for signing, not for questions. A question in the open, before the whole Reach, on the holiest day of the holiest peace, was the heresy itself, the doubt made loud. She thought of the small gray ship that had come in gentle and quiet, and had not boasted once. She thought of a people who had built a machine as good as this one, and had almost died of trusting it, and had survived, and had crossed the long dark to sit in a corner of someone else's arena, and, very politely, ask if anyone here had remembered to keep a real fleet. She gave the long patience permission to ask its question. It was the bravest thing she had ever done, and she did it sitting down, alone, in the dark, by sending one short line on a private channel, and she would spend the rest of her life knowing it was the moment her people were saved. The third day came. The whole Reach gathered in the high galleries of the arena, the heralds of the Vels and the Karun in their places, the scorekeepers of 9 species at their desks, the old contest hanging frozen and beautiful in the deep tank below, waiting to be certified true and renewed. Vesh Oda stood at the high desk with the certificate before her and the blank line for the human signature, and she should have read the right, and instead she did the thing she had decided alone in the dark. She announced that the witness had asked leave to speak, and that, as keeper of the right, she had granted it. The hall did not like it. She felt the dislike come up at her from the galleries like heat off a stone. The herald of the Vels demanded to know since when a witness spoke. The herald of the Karoon said nothing, and watched, the way the old patient counters always watched. Vesh Oda held the desk and held her ground and asked the long patients to speak. Her 4 hands were trembling on the desk, and she pressed them flat so the heralds would not see. She had broken the right. She, the keeper of it, the 17th of her line, had stood up on the holiest day of the holiest peace and handed the floor to a witness who had no right to it, on the strength of 2 nights of quiet talk with a ship she had been told was barbaric. If she was wrong, her line would end in disgrace, her name struck from the desk, 200 years of careful service erased in a single morning. She knew all of that, and she did it anyway, because she had spent 2 nights listening to a people who had nearly died of being certain, and she had decided, somewhere in the dark, that she would rather be wrong and disgraced than certain and asleep. It was not courage exactly. It was the opposite of certainty, which she was only beginning to understand was the same thing. And the small gray ship in the visitor's ring, the Splinter, the thing 900 meters long in a hall built for fleets, spoke to the whole reach for the first time. It thanked them. It thanked them with real respect, for the seat, for the honor, for 9,000 years of a peace it called one of the finest things it had ever been shown. And then it asked its question, plainly, in the open, the question it had carried since the gate. It asked the reach to imagine an enemy that would not be measured. Not a stronger fleet, not a cleverer admiral, an enemy that simply did not agree, that looked at the great machine and the perfect score, and the 9,000 years of honest wars, and did not submit a fleet, did not accept the count, did not bow to the number, and came on anyway, in real ships, in real dark, after the score said it should be gone. And it asked the reach, gently, what the machine would do with such a thing, what number it would give, where, in 9,000 years of modeled wars between people who had all agreed to be modeled, the reach had hidden the answer to a war against someone who refused. The hall was silent. The herald of the Vels said it was a foolish question, because no such enemy existed, because everyone in the civilized arm of the sky used the machine, because using the machine was what made you civilized. The long patients agreed that no such enemy existed in the reach. Then it asked the second question, the one that turned the first into a knife. It asked how the reach would know. How would the reach know, it asked, if such an enemy were already inside the arm of the sky, watching the great machine, learning that the whole galaxy had agreed to let a number decide its wars, learning that not one power in 9,000 years had kept a real fleet because the model said they didn't need to? How would the reach know, when the first move of an enemy who refuses to be measured is precisely to let you keep believing your measurement is the truth? An enemy like that would not announce itself. It would not enter the machine. It would wait and watch and let the peace grow deep and certain and undefended, and it would come on the day the reach was most sure it could not be touched, which was every day, which was today. And Vesh Oda, standing at the high desk with the blank certificate, understood that the human ship was not making a point about an enemy that might exist someday. It was telling them one already had. The proof did not come from the human ship. It came from the machine, and that was what broke the reach open. The long patience asked one favor, in the open, before the whole hall. It asked the reach to let it feed a single fleet into the great machine, not its own, a fleet it had logged on the way in, drifting at the far dark edge of the third gate, beyond the watch buoys, sitting silent in the cold, where the reach never looked, because the reach had not needed to look outward in 9,000 years. The human ship had scanned it on the way through, the way a careful guest counts the exits, and it had said nothing then because saying it then would have been a boast, and the long patience did not boast. Now it asked the Reach to model that fleet against the renewal contest, and to watch what the machine did. The Herald of the Vels refused. The Herald of the Karun, who had been counting weaknesses for 11,000 years and had learned that the most dangerous silence is the one at the edge of your own map, overruled him, and Vesh Oda, Keeper of the Right, granted it. She did not know yet what she was granting. She knew only that the small gray ship had not lied to her once in 2 nights, and that the old patient herald of the Karun had gone very still, and that stillness in an old counter is the loudest alarm there is. The machine took the new fleet's profile from the long patience and began to model it. Vesh Oda watched the intake the way she had watched 10,000 intakes, and at first it looked ordinary. The machine drew the dark fleet's mass and shape and number into itself, 1,100 hulls of an old and unfamiliar design, and it began to build them in the deep tank in cold blue fire, the way it built everything. The Herald of the Vels relaxed a little. See, his posture said, "It is only a fleet. The machine eats fleets. This will take an hour, and give a number, and the strange gray ship will be shown to be a doomsayer over nothing." Then the build stuttered. It could not. Vesh Oda watched the deep logs fill, and for the first time in 200 years of reading them, they filled wrong. The machine modeled by agreement. It took a fleet's submitted shape, its accepted rules, its agreed limits, and it ran the war along the branches those rules allowed. But the fleet at the edge of the third gate had submitted nothing. It had no agreed limits because it had never agreed to be measured. The machine reached for the rules that would let it run the war, and the rules were not there, and so it did the only thing it had ever learned to do when a value was missing. It assumed. It assumed the Dark Fleet would fight the way fleets in the Reach fought. It assumed the Dark Fleet would accept the score. It assumed the Dark Fleet would, at the branch where the count went against it, do what every fleet in 9,000 years had done, which was to break off, to yield, to bow to the number. The machine built its model of the unmeasured enemy entirely out of the habits of measured ones, because those were the only habits it knew, and it ran the war, and the score came back clean and blue and reassuring, and it said the Reach would win easily. The machine said the Reach would win easily, and the long patience said, very quietly, that this was exactly the number a machine gives you right before you die. Vesh Oda read the deep logs 3 times to be sure, because what she was reading was the most dangerous thing she had ever read, and the danger was that it looked completely safe. The score was blue. The score was good. By every measure she had trusted for 200 years, the Reach had nothing to fear. And yet the logs underneath the score were full of holes, full of the small gray marks the machine used when it had to assume a value, and there were more of those marks in this one model than in all the 10,000 models she had certified in her life put together. The machine had not run a war. It had run 1,000 guesses about a war, every guess filled with the habit of an enemy who did not exist, and then it had averaged the guesses and dressed the average in blue and called it a score with no war under it, a confidence with nothing inside. She had spent her life teaching young scorekeepers that the score was the truth, and the logs were only the machine showing its work. She understood now that she had taught it backwards. The score was the story the machine told itself so it could stop thinking. The logs were the truth, and the truth was that the machine did not know, and had hidden its not knowing under a number, the way a frightened child hums in the dark to pretend the dark is empty. Because the Dark Fleet would not fight the way the model assumed, the model had filled every missing value with the comfortable habit of an enemy who plays by the rules, and the Dark Fleet at the gate had never agreed to a single rule. The machine had not modeled the enemy. It had modeled a polite reflection of itself, wearing the enemy's tonnage, and it had scored that reflection, and the score was worse than useless, because it was confident. A frightened machine that says it does not know is a warning. A confident machine that is wrong is a trap, and the Reach had been sitting inside the trap for 9,000 years, mistaking the walls for safety. The hall began, slowly, to be afraid. It was a strange thing to watch, fear coming into a hall that had not held it in 90 centuries. The heralds of the Reach had never been afraid here. They had come to win or to lose with their honor intact, and even the losing had been a kind of comfort, because the loser walked out with every ship still warm and every soul still breathing. None of them had ever stood in the high galleries and understood that the dark beyond the walls held a real fleet that did not care about their honor and would not give back their ships. Vesh Oda watched the fear move from gallery to gallery, slow at first and then not slow, the way water moves into a room through a single crack and then through the whole floor at once. The Herald of the Vels had stopped speaking. The scorekeepers of 9 species had stopped reading their desks. The whole arena had gone still, 90 kilometers of careful peace holding its breath, and into the stillness came the one sound none of them had a name for, which was the sound of certainty cracking. The Herald of the Karun asked the question the whole arm of stars should have asked 9,000 years before. He asked who the Dark Fleet was. The Long Patience told them. It called them the Unanswered. It said the human ship did not know their true name, because they had never given one, because giving a name is a kind of agreement, and the Unanswered agreed to nothing. They were an old thing, older than the Reach, a war people from before the machine, who had watched the whole arm of the sky lay down its real fleets, one civilization at a time, and call it peace. They did not use the machine. They did not believe in the score. They believed in the one thing the Reach had spent 9,000 years forgetting, which was that a war is decided by who is still moving at the end, and nothing else, and no number changes that. They had not attacked, the Long Patience said, for the simplest and most patient reason in the galaxy. They had not needed to. Why spend ships to take a thing that is disarming itself? The Unanswered had only to wait while the Reach grew sure, and the Reach grew sure a little more with every renewal. Every 9,000 years of unbroken peace, another layer of certainty laid over the bare fact that no one here had kept anything real that could fight. The Dark Fleet at the gate was not an invasion. It was a measurement of its own. It had come to see how far the disarming had gone, to read how undefended the proudest peace in the sky finally was, and the machine, by scoring it as a polite enemy and promising an easy win, had just told the watchers at the gate the one thing they came to learn. The one thing they came to learn was this, that the Reach believed it was safe, that the Reach would not fight, because the Reach was sure it would not have to, that the harvest was ripe. The human ship explained the patience of it, because the patience was the whole horror, and the Reach needed to understand the horror before it could be saved from it. The Unanswered did not measure time the way young powers did. They had been old when the Atu were learning to count. They had watched the first piece of the Reach made, 9,000 years ago, and they had understood at once what the talking powers did not, which was that a piece built on a model is a piece that disarms itself a little more every year, because each year of safety makes the real fleet feel a little more like waste. They had not needed to break the peace. They had only needed to outlast it, to wait the way a tide waits, certain and unhurried, while the proud powers of the arm of the sky carried their real ships to the breaking yards 1 decade at a time and told each other it was wisdom. The Unanswered had spent 9,000 years doing nothing at all, and the nothing had been the most patient campaign in the history of the galaxy, and it had very nearly worked. The Hall understood, now, all at once, and the understanding was a cold and terrible thing, because there was no fleet in it. 9 species, 9,000 years, the greatest powers in the arm of the sky, gathered in one hall, and not one of them had brought a single ship built to fight a war that did not play by the rules. They had brought heralds and scorekeepers and grand-modeled fleets that existed only inside a sphere of cold logic 40 kilometers down. The real arena, the visitor's ring, the gate, the cold dark beyond it, held exactly one ship that had ever been built to fight an enemy who refused to be counted. It was 900 meters long, and it was gray, and it had come in gentle, and it had been called a splinter. The Herald of the Vels, who had laughed on the first day, did not laugh now. He demanded that the human ship do something. He demanded that the witness, who had brought this horror into the open on the holy third day, now answer for it, now defend them, now fight. And the Long Patience, for the first time, said no. It said it would not fight the Unanswered for them, and the no was not cruelty, the no was the lesson, and Vesh Oda was the only soul in the hall who had heard enough of the human ship in the dark to understand it before it was explained. The long patience said that if it fought their war for them, it would only build them a new machine, a new number to trust, a new thing to lay down their real ships behind and call peace, until the day the new number was wrong and there was no human ship in the corner to save them again. It said the kindest thing it could do and the cruelest thing it could do were the same thing, and it was this. It would show them, once, what a war against an enemy who refuses to be measured actually looks like, so that they would never again mistake a confident number for a kept fleet. It said the dark fleet at the gate was already moving. The watch buoys at the third gate, which had slept for 9,000 peaceful years, woke and sang the song they had been built for and never used, and the long readout on Vesh Oda's high desk filled with shapes coming in from the cold, and the unanswered came on, in real ships, in real dark, after no count and no score and no agreement, exactly as the human ship had said they would. There were 1,100 of them. The machine, asked to model the engagement, gave back a clean blue number and promised the Reach an easy victory, and the number was a lie, and every soul in the hall now knew it was a lie, and that knowing was the most frightened the Reach had been in 90 centuries. The 1,100 ships of the unanswered did not hail. They did not boast. They did not enter the machine. They came across the dark toward the arena moon where 9 species sat undefended behind a number, and they came the way the cold comes, without hurry, without doubt, with the patience of a thing that has waited a very long time to be proven right about the whole talking galaxy. The grand modeled fleets hung frozen and useless in the deep tank. 40,000 ships of blue fire that could not fire, 10 million imaginary souls who could not lift a hand, the whole proud machinery of the peace revealed in one cold moment as exactly what it had always been, which was make-believe, beautiful and honest, and completely unable to stop a single real ship that had refused to play. And in the visitor's ring, the small gray splinter that had never trusted any of it, the only real fleet the Reach had, the witness that had been invited only to watch, moved for the first time in 3 days. It did not arm loudly. It did not throw light or shout tonnage. It simply turned, slow and certain, away from the high desk and the frozen tank and the frightened hall, and faced the third gate and the 1,100 ships coming out of the cold, and Vesh Oda, watching from the high desk with the unsigned certificate forgotten under her 4 hands, understood that she was about to see the one thing the great machine had never once been able to model. A real war, fought by a real ship, against an enemy who had agreed to nothing. There was a moment, just before it moved, when the whole arena seemed to understand at once what it was looking at. The small gray splinter that had been mocked on the first day and called a doomsayer on the second was the only thing standing between 9 species and the cold. Every grand fleet in the deep tank was a ghost. Every herald in the high galleries was unarmed. The proudest piece in the arm of the sky had, in its whole vast machinery, exactly one ship that could fight, and it was the one ship the Reach had been certain it did not need, the one it had invited only to watch, the one it had voted, in a chamber whose minutes Vesh Oda kept, to call the last barbarian. The shame of that understanding ran through the galleries alongside the fear, and the two of them together made a silence so complete that Vesh Oda could hear the small sounds of her own desk, the tick of the readout, the breath of the cooling, the quiet machinery of a piece that had just learned it was made of paper. The long patience sent her one last private line before it went out to the gate, and it was not a boast, and it was not a warning, and it was the kindest and most frightening thing anyone had ever said to her. It said, "Watch carefully, scorekeeper. This is the number your machine could not give you. After today you will keep your own." The 1,100 ships of the unanswered crossed the last of the dark and reached the third gate, and the long patience was already there. It had not raced. Vesh Oda watched the readout and saw that the human ship moved at a speed that looked almost lazy, the way it had done everything, and yet it was at the gate before the dark fleet was through it, because it had read the geometry of the arena the way it read everything, completely, the moment it arrived, and it had known 3 days ago exactly where it would need to stand. The witness had chosen its ground on the first day, while everyone else was still laughing at its size. The unanswered fired first. They fired the way a people fires who has never once agreed that any number can stop them. 1,100 ships. Every gun. No formality. No opening move. No announcement of tonnage. Just the full and patient violence of a thing that decided long ago that the only true measure of a war is who is still moving. The cold dark at the third gate lit white. The watch buoys, 9,000 years asleep, recorded a weight of fire that would have ended any fleet the Reach had ever fed into the machine, and the machine, asked to model the moment, gave back a clean number and said the human ship was gone. The human ship was not gone. Vesh Oda would spend the rest of her long life trying to describe what she saw, and she would never get it right, because the machine had no language for it, and neither did she. The fire reached the long patience, and the long patience did not break, and did not burn, and did not, as far as any scope in the arena could tell, particularly notice. The gray hull took the full weight of 1,100 ships and held, and the white fire washed over it and around it, and went out against it like a wave going out against a stone that has been on its shore for 10,000 years, and the stone does not move, because the stone is not in a hurry, because the stone is the thing the wave is wearing itself out against. The scopes on Vesh Oda's high desk tried to read the damage and found none. She watched the readout cycle through every measure of harm it knew. Hull breach, drive loss, system failure, and every measure came back clean, and the cleanness was more frightening than any wound could have been. She had certified 900 fleets in her life, and she had never once seen a ship take fire and show nothing. Even the strongest hulls in the modeled wars showed something, a flicker, a scorch, a moment of the shield drinking deep. The human ship showed the cold, even glow it had shown for 3 days, unchanged, as though the fire of 1,100 ships were a weather it had decided to wait out rather than an attack it had to survive. The Reach had spent 9,000 years measuring how much a ship could take. The long patience was teaching it, in one terrible quiet moment, that the question had a floor it had never imagined, a place where a ship simply takes everything you have, and the everything is not enough, and there is no number large enough to be enough, because the ship was never built to be measured in the units you brought. The machine, in the deep tank, tried to update its model with this new value, and could not, because there was no value. A ship that takes the full fire of 1,100 hulls and is unmarked is not a higher number. It is a different kind of thing. The machine had been built to count how much, and the human ship was teaching the whole arena that the real question had never been how much. The real question had always been what kind, and that was the one question the machine had never learned to ask. Then the long patience answered. It did not answer with more fire. Vesh Oda noticed that first, and she would remember it longest, because in 9,000 years of modeled wars, she had learned that a war is 2 fleets pouring fire into each other until one fleet has less left, and the long patience did not do that. It reached out across the gate, not with weapons exactly, with something quieter, and it took the 1,100 ships of the unanswered, the way a grown hand takes a fistful of falling sand, gently, completely, all at once, and it held them. It held 1,100 ships still in the dark. They fired, and the fire did not reach. They drove their engines, and the engines did not move them. The unanswered, who had agreed to nothing in their whole long history, who refused every rule and every count and every number, met the one thing in the arm of the sky that did not require their agreement, because it did not measure them at all. The human ship had not modeled them. It had not scored them. It had simply reached across the gate and held them, and there is no rule you can refuse your way out of when the thing holding you never asks you to agree to anything. Vesh Oda understood, watching it, why the unanswered had never been beaten in their whole long history, and why they were beaten now. Their strength had always been the refusal. Every enemy they had ever met had tried to measure them, to model them, to fit them into a rule, and the unanswered had simply declined the rule and kept moving, and the enemy's careful measurement had become a careful map of a country that was no longer there. The refusal was a wall against every kind of force that worked by agreement. But the human ship did not work by agreement. It had not asked the unanswered to be anything. It had not built a model of them to break. It had reached out with a bare hand and closed it, the way you close a hand on a thing whether the thing consents or not, and the refusal had nothing to push against, because the human ship had never offered the unanswered the one thing their whole strength depended on, which was a rule to break. You cannot refuse a hand. You can only be held by it. The herald of the Vels, in the high gallery, made a sound Vesh Oda had no name for, half terror and half worship. The machine in the tank gave up. Vesh Oda watched the deep logs, and for the first time in 9,000 years, the great machine, asked to model the engagement at the gate, returned no number. It returned a blank, the same blank it would have returned for a value that does not exist, for a question with no answer. And Vesh Oda understood that the blank was the truest thing the machine had ever said. It was the machine, after 90 centuries of false confidence, finally admitting the one honest thing it knew. That there are wars it cannot count, that there are ships it cannot measure, that the number had always had an edge, far out past the comfortable middle, and the human ship was standing on the far side of that edge holding 1,100 enemies in one open hand. And then the long patience did the thing that turned the whole day from a battle into a lesson, the thing Vesh Oda would carry to the end of her line. It did not destroy them. Vesh Oda had certified 10,000 modeled wars, and every one of them had ended the same way. One fleet stood, and the other was reckoned gone, scored to zero, unmade in the cold blue fire of the tank, because that was what winning was. That was the shape the machine had taught the whole galaxy to expect. She watched the high desk waiting for the human ship to do the thing winning meant. She watched the readout, certain it would show the 1,100 ships go dark one after another, the way the modeled fleets always did, and she would write the number, and the number would be 1,100, and the lesson would be terrible and clean. She had spent her whole life inside an arithmetic, where the end of a war was a subtraction. The human ship did not subtract. It held the 1,100 ships of the unanswered, completely, helplessly, in the cold at the gate, and it had every power to unmake them, and the whole frightened reach in the high galleries was screaming, in 9 languages, for it to do exactly that. And the human ship did not. It held them, and it opened a channel to them, the dark fleet that had never accepted a channel in its long history, and it spoke to them the way it had spoken to Vesh Oda in the dark, with respect, and the respect was the most frightening weapon anyone in that hall had ever seen used, because you cannot refuse to agree with respect. There is no rule in it to break. It told the unanswered that it knew them, that it knew what they were, a people who had watched the whole talking galaxy lay down its real fleets, and call it wisdom, and who had kept their own real fleet, and their own hard truth, and waited at the edge of the map for the harvest. It told them that it understood, because humanity had nearly been the harvest once, on the one wet world, and humanity had survived the way the unanswered had survived, by refusing to forget that a war is who is still moving at the end. And then it told them the one thing that ended the war without a single ship destroyed. It told them they were too late, because the harvest they had waited 9,000 years for, the undefended peace, the disarmed galaxy that had laid down everything real, had just, in the last hour, learned the lesson. The Reach had watched the machine return a blank. The Reach had watched 1,100 ships of an enemy who refused to be counted, held helpless by a thing that did not count. The Reach had seen, in the open, on the holiest day of its holiest peace, that a confident number is not a kept fleet, and that lesson, once seen, could not be unseen. The disarmed were disarmed no longer, not because they had built ships in the last hour, but because they had remembered, in the last hour, why ships are kept. And a people who remembers why is not a harvest. A people who remembers why is the hardest thing in the galaxy to take. The unanswered had waited 9,000 years for a ripe field, and the human ship had let them come all the way to the gate, into the open, in front of the whole Reach, precisely so that their coming would teach the lesson that ended their long patient hope forever. The witness had not won the battle by holding 1,100 ships. It had won the war by making sure the whole arm of the sky watched it do so. The Dark Fleet was silent for a long time. Vesh Oda watched the readout and the silence, and she did not breathe. Then the unanswered did the thing they had never done in their whole history. They answered. Not with surrender, because surrender is a kind of agreement, and the unanswered did not agree, even now. They answered with a single line, the first the human ship had ever pulled from them, and Vesh Oda read it on her high desk and felt the whole weight of 9,000 years shift onto a new and steadier foundation. The line said only that they saw. That was all. They saw. They saw that the field was no longer ripe, that the talking galaxy had grown, in 1 hour, a memory it would not lose, and that there was nothing here for them anymore, because there is no taking a thing that has remembered why it is worth keeping. The long patience opened its hand. It released the 1,100 ships, whole, unmarked, every hull intact, and the unanswered did not fire again, because firing again would only feed the lesson, and the unanswered, whatever else they were not fools. They turned, slowly, the way the human ship turned, and they went back out through the third gate into the cold dark they had come from, and they did not boast, and did not threaten, and did not promise to return, because the unanswered did not make promises, and they were gone. 1,100 ships came in. 1,100 ships left. Not one was destroyed. The deadliest war the Reach had ever witnessed, the only real war in 9,000 years, the war the great machine could not model, ended with every soul on both sides still alive, and that, Vesh Oda understood, was the second lesson folded inside the first. The human ship had not come to kill the unanswered. It had come to retire them, to end their patient hope by curing the weakness they were waiting on, and a cured weakness needs no corpse to prove it gone. She thought about that for the rest of her life, the choosing of it. The human ship had held the oldest enemy in the galaxy in one open hand, with the whole Reach begging it to close that hand, and it had not closed it. Not because it was weak, not because it was kind in the soft way that lets a thing go because it cannot bear to hurt it. It had let the unanswered go, because killing them would have taught the wrong lesson, would have left the Reach believing that the answer to a war it could not model was a bigger gun, a stronger ship, a fleet that could subtract harder, and the answer was not a bigger gun. The answer was a people that remembered why it kept its fleet, and you cannot teach a people to remember by showing it a heap of dead ships. You teach it by showing it the thing the dead ships were sent to take, still standing, awake, no longer asleep. The corpse would have been a trophy. The empty gate and the lesson learned was the actual victory, and the human ship had wanted the victory and refused the trophy because it had buried enough trophies of its own on the one wet world to know the difference. The long patience turned back from the gate, slow and certain, and recrossed the arena to the visitors' ring, and took its berth again, the small gray splinter in the corner of a hall built for fleets. And it stopped, and it did nothing, exactly as it had done for 3 days, as if the only real war in 9,000 years had been a small errand it was glad to have finished. The whole Reach was silent. 9 species, 9,000 years, the proudest piece in the arm of the sky, all of it staring down from the high galleries at a ship 900 meters long that had just shown them the floor of their own world. Vesh Oda stood at the high desk, with the unsigned certificate under her 4 hands. The blank line for the human signature was still blank. The right was unfinished. The renewal of the machine had not happened, and Vesh Oda understood, now, that it never would, not the way it had been written, because the thing the right was meant to renew was a lie, and you cannot renew a lie once the whole arm of the sky has watched it return a blank. She did not pick up the certificate. She did something else, the second bravest thing she had ever done. She opened the channel to the long patience, in the open, before the whole hall, and she did the one thing a scorekeeper of her line had never done in 9,000 years. She asked it a question. She asked the human ship what the Reach was supposed to do now. It was the question every soul in the high galleries was holding, and not one of them had dared to ask it, because to ask it out loud was to admit that the 9,000-year peace had just ended in front of them, and admitting that was the heresy the Reach had built its whole law to forbid. Vesh Oda asked it anyway, at the high desk, before the heralds and the scorekeepers of 9 species, because she had learned in 3 nights what it cost to leave the real question unasked, and she would not leave it unasked again. The long patience answered her, and it answered the whole Reach, and it was the gentlest verdict ever handed down in that hall. It told them to keep the machine. That was the first surprise, and it ran through the galleries like cold water. The human ship did not tell them to destroy the great machine, the sphere of cold logic, 40 kilometers down, that had just been shown to be a lie. It told them to keep it, to use it, to feed it their wars, and read its numbers, and learn everything it could teach, because the machine was the finest tool for understanding a war that the galaxy had ever built, and a people who throws away a fine tool because it once fooled them has learned nothing except a new way to be foolish. But it told them to change one law, the only law that mattered, the law written, now, in the keel of the human ship, the law humanity had paid for with its own near death on the one wet world. The model serves the fleet never serves the model. Use the machine to learn, the long patience said, never to decide. Run 1,000 wars in the cold logic, and read every one and grow wise on them, and then go out into the real dark and keep a real fleet, crewed by people who have agreed to nothing, because the day you let the number decide is the day you hand your throat to the first enemy who refuses to count. The machine is a map. A map is a great and useful thing, but you do not lay down on the map and call it the country, and you do not disarm in the territory because the map says the territory is safe. The Reach had spent 9,000 years confusing the map for the country, and the unanswered had been standing in the country the whole time, patiently, waiting for the day the Reach finally forgot it was there. Keep the machine, the human ship said. Keep your real fleets too. Let the second teach you to use the first, and never again the other way around. It gave them one more image, and Vesh Oda wrote it into the new right word for word, because it was the clearest thing anyone had ever said in that hall. A map, the long patience said, is built from the country. You walk the country, and you write down what you find, and the writing becomes the map, and the map is true because the country came first. But the Reach had done it backwards. The Reach had drawn its map 9,000 years ago, and then stopped walking the country, and every year the map and the country drifted further apart, and because no one walked the country anymore, no one noticed the drift. The unanswered were a whole continent the map did not show, and the Reach had been navigating by the map so long that when the continent finally rose up under its feet, the Reach's first instinct had been to check the map, and the map had said the continent was not there. Walk the country, the human ship said. Keep walking it, forever, even when the map is good, especially when the map is good, because a map you have stopped checking against the country is not a map anymore. It is a story you tell yourself about a country you no longer know. The herald of the Karun, the old patient counter, spoke then and asked the question under the question. He asked why the human ship had bothered, why a people that owed the Reach nothing, that had been called barbaric and unsimulated, and the last unsimulated people in a vote, whose minutes Vesh Oda kept, had crossed the long dark to sit in a corner and save a galaxy that had spent 9,000 years looking down on it. And the long patience told them the thing that Vesh Oda would carry the longest, longer than the held fleet, longer than the blank in the tank. It said that humanity had been the harvest once. It said that a long time ago, a thing like the unanswered had come for the one wet world, and humanity had nearly become a field of ash and a lesson for someone else, and it had survived by the narrowest margin in its history, and it had made one promise to itself in the cold after, when it counted how few of itself were left. The promise was this: humanity would not let another young or proud or sleeping people walk the road it had nearly died walking. Not if humanity could reach them in time. Not if a single gray ship in a corner of someone else's arena could be the warning that humanity itself had never gotten. The Reach had thought it invited a witness. It had, in fact, invited the one people in the arm of the sky whose entire reason for crossing the dark was to make sure no one else found out, the hard way, the thing humanity had found out the hardest way there is. The witness had not come to watch the machine renewed. It had come to keep the Reach from dying of the same disease that had nearly killed the world that built it, and it had waited 3 days, and let the Dark Fleet come all the way to the gate, and held 1,100 ships in one open hand, not to frighten the Reach, but to teach it, because a lesson watched is a lesson kept, and a lesson kept is the only wall that holds. The hall was quiet for a long time. Then Vesh Oda, scorekeeper of her line, keeper of the right, did the last thing the day asked of her. She took the certificate, the renewal of the long decision, the right written in a hand older than her grandmother's grandmother, and she did not sign it. She set it down, in the open, before the whole Reach, and she said that the right was finished, not renewed, because the thing it renewed was a lie the galaxy could no longer afford, and she said that a new right would be written by the 9 species together, and the new right would keep the machine, and keep the fleets, and keep the lesson, and the witness's question, the one it had carried in its closed hand through the 3rd gate, would be carved at the head of it, so that no scorekeeper of any line, in any age, would ever again forget to ask what the machine does when it meets a thing it cannot model. The human ship did not sign anything either. It had not come to sign. It had come to ask a question, and the question was answered, and the answer was a galaxy that had remembered why it kept its ships, and that was the only signature the long patience had ever wanted. It stayed one more day. Vesh Oda spent that day at the visitor's ring, not at the high desk, learning everything the human ship would teach her, and it taught her a great deal, freely, the way it did everything. It taught her how its own people ran their simulations, more and better than the Reach ever had, and never once let one decide. It taught her how to read a number for what it could not see as carefully as for what it could. It taught her, most of all, the small, hard humility that was the real keel of every human ship, the knowledge that you do not understand a war until you have admitted the parts of it you cannot count. She asked it, near the end of that day, the question she had wanted to ask since the first night and had been too much of a clerk to ask. She asked it how strong it really was, how much of itself it had used to hold 1,100 ships and turn the oldest patience in the galaxy away from the gate. She expected it to refuse the question, the way it had refused to boast about anything in 3 days. Instead, it answered her, plainly, because she had asked, and the answer was the last thing she needed to understand the whole of it. It told her that it had used very little, that holding the Dark Fleet had cost it about what holding a single falling cup costs a steady hand, that the long patience was not, by the measure of its own people, a large ship, or an old one, or a particularly fearsome one. It was a witness. It had been chosen for this errand precisely because it was small enough to fit in a corner and quiet enough to be mistaken for a splinter, and because the lesson the Reach needed was not how large humanity could be, but how little of largeness it took to undo a piece that had forgotten why it kept its fleets. The most frightening thing the human ship ever told her was not that it was strong. It was that, by the standards of the people who built it, it was ordinary, and the ordinary had been more than enough. And on the 2nd day, in the morning of the arena's long cycle, the long patience turned in its berth, slow and certain, and went out the way it had come, gentle and quiet, no light, no broadcast, a small gray hull sliding through the 3rd gate into the cold dark, and it was gone, before the watchboys were sure it had moved at all, exactly as it had arrived, the splinter that had shown the whole arm of the sky the floor of its own world, and asked nothing for it, but a question answered. Vesh Oda watched it go from the high desk, and she did not try to follow it, because the long patience did not want following, and because she had a great deal of work to do. She lived 200 more years. She spent the first of them writing the new right, with the 9 species, and it was the hardest and proudest work of her long life. The machine stayed. The great sphere of cold logic ran on, and the Reach fed it wars and read its numbers and grew wiser on them than it had ever been, because now it asked the machine the right question, which was not who will win, but what am I not seeing, and the Reach kept its fleets. Real fleets, in the real dark, crewed by people who had agreed to nothing, not because the Reach expected the unanswered to return, but because a people that keeps its fleets is a people no patient watcher at the edge of the map ever bothers to wait for, and the surest way to never be harvested is to never again look ripe. The Vels and the Karun changed too, in the years after, and Vesh Oda watched the change with a quiet that was almost joy. The two oldest enemies in the Reach, who had brought their 400-year grief to the deep tank for 9,000 years and never once let it cool, sat together in the writing of the new right, and somewhere in the long work of it, they stopped being two powers who hated each other and became two powers who had been frightened by the same dark on the same morning. It is a strange medicine, a shared fear. The machine had drained their war of its dead and called that peace, but it had never touched the hate, because the hate had nothing to do with the dead. The hate was older than the dead. The morning at the gate touched it. They had stood in the same gallery and watched the same splinter hold the same cold back from both of them at once, and a thing you have been saved from together is harder to keep hating across. The human ship had not meant to mend that quarrel. It had only meant to teach a lesson. But the deepest lessons mend things their teachers never aimed at, and Vesh Oda, who had spent 200 years certifying the cheap peace, lived to certify a true one. The unanswered did not return. Vesh Oda watched the third gate for the rest of her life, and the cold dark beyond it stayed cold and dark and empty, and she understood why. There was nothing here for them anymore. The field had remembered why it was worth keeping, and you cannot take a thing that remembers. The human ship had not killed the Dark Fleet's 1,100 hulls. It had killed the Dark Fleet's 9,000-year patience, which was the only weapon the unanswered had ever truly carried, and a people whose patience has been taken does not come back to the place that took it. She trained her own successors differently after that. For 200 years she had taught the young scorekeepers that the score was the truth and the logs were the showing of the work, and now she taught them the other way, the human way, the hard way. She made them read the logs first and the score last. She made them count the gray marks, the assumed values, the places where the machine had filled a gap with a habit, and she taught them that the number of those marks was the real measure of a model, that a score with few marks under it could be trusted, and a score with many was a story the machine was telling itself. She made them, every one of them, stand at the high desk and say aloud the thing that had once been heresy. I do not know. She taught them that a scorekeeper who could not say it was not a scorekeeper but a worshipper, and that the difference between the two had nearly cost the Reach everything. The young ones found it uncomfortable at first, the not knowing, the way she had. Then they found it was the only honest place to stand, and they stood there, and the Reach was safer for every one of them. Vesh Oda founded an order before she died. She called it the Keepers of the Blank, after the one honest thing the great machine had ever said. The blank it returned at the gate, when it finally met a thing it could not count. The Keepers had one duty, written in their first line, and it was the human ship's question, carved into the keel of a whole people. They were to read every score the machine ever gave, and beside each one, to write the thing the score could not see, the value that was missing, the assumption the machine had filled with a comfortable habit. They were to be the doubt the Reach had once called heresy and now called wisdom, the small cold thread of "are we sure" that runs down the back of every certainty and keeps it honest. And in 9,000 more years, no power of the Reach ever again laid down a real fleet, because a number told it that it was safe, and that, more than any battle, was the war the human ship had truly won. She thought about the long patience often, in her last years. She thought about how it had come in gentle, and been called a splinter, and how she had looked at the smallest ship in the arena and believed the smallest thing about it, the number 900 meters, and how that number had been the most wrong thing she ever counted. She thought about how the deadliest ship in the arm of the sky had not fired a single shot to destroy in 3 days, had held 1,100 enemies in one open hand and let every one of them go home, had won the only real war in 9,000 years by making sure the whole galaxy watched it choose not to kill. She thought about a people who had nearly been ash and had survived, and had spent its survival crossing the long dark to keep strangers from walking the road it had nearly died on, asking nothing, signing nothing, leaving nothing behind but a question and a galaxy that would not forget the answer. And she understood, at the end, the thing she had not understood at the beginning, the thing the great machine could never have modeled, and she could never quite have counted. The strongest thing in the arm of the sky was not the fleet that could pour the most fire. It was not the machine that could imagine the most wars. It was the ship strong enough to hold its enemies still, and gentle enough to open its hand, the people sure enough of their own strength that they did not need to prove it on a corpse, the quiet gray splinter that had earned, through near death and through memory and through the long patience of those who have grieved enough to never want anyone else to, the rarest right in the whole talking galaxy, the right to be the strongest ship in the dark, and to keep the guns put away, and to spend that strength reaching across the cold to a stranger and saying, before it is too late, the one thing humanity itself had never been told in time: keep your fleet. Trust the machine to teach you, never to save you, and when a thing comes out of the cold that will not be counted, remember that you were warned by a small gray ship that crossed the whole dark to warn you, and ask for nothing in return but that you live. Vesh Oda, 17th scorekeeper of her line, first keeper of the blank, died old and content, in the high galleries of the arena she had spent her life tending, with the new right carved at the head of the hall, and the question of the long patience carved at the head of the right, and the great machine running honest in the deep below her, and a real fleet keeping the dark beyond the third gate, and a galaxy that had remembered, in 1 hour, the lesson that one quiet ship had crossed the cold to teach. The certificate she never signed was kept, unsigned, in a case at the head of the hall, beside the new right, where every scorekeeper after her could see it. It was the most important document in the history of the Reach, and it was blank where the witness should have signed, and the blank was the whole point. The witness had not come to add its name to the lie. It had come to leave the line empty, so that the empty line would ask, forever, the question the human ship had carried through the third gate in its closed hand. What does the machine do when it meets a thing it cannot model? And under it, written in Vesh Oda's own four-handed script, in the last year of her long life, the answer the whole galaxy had learned to give, the answer that kept the peace true for 9,000 years more. It returns a blank. And a wise people keeps its fleet anyway, and is grateful, forever, for the small gray ship that crossed the cold dark to teach it the difference between a number and the truth, and asked in return only a question, and answered it itself, and went home.